Okay, well, we'll talk about Teilhard. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, born in 1881. He entered the Jesuit novitiate in Aix-en-Provence. But when religious orders were expelled from France in 1902, he sought refuge in Jersey, where there was a seminary, and he studied there scholastic philosophy and geology. After 3 years, he was then dispatched to Cairo, where for another 3 years he taught physics and chemistry at Holy Family College. I think it's important to understand that he had a background in physics. In 1908, he read Henri Bergson's Creative Evolution, which apparently introduced him to evolution. Subsequently, in Hastings, England, he joined Charles Dawson's group as a paleontologist, where he became enmeshed in the Piltdown Man scandal. Stephen Jay Gould wrote an article in which he tried to show that Teilhard was one of the planners. I think Teilhard was simply duped like everybody else. After a service as a stretcher bearer in World War I, he returned to Paris in 1919, completed his doctoral dissertation on Eocene mammals under Marcellin Boule, and then in 1923 he was sent to China, usually referred to as exiled to China, because he ran afoul of his superiors by writing on non-scientific topics. In China, he wrote The Phenomenon of Man in 1929 and was later part of the team that studied Sinanthropus, so-called Peking man. His specialty was fossil mammals, but he was also a member of Henry Fairfield Osborn's famous Trans-Asia, I forget the actual name of the expedition, but in any case, Teilhard synthesized the continental geography of Asia, which was a tremendous accomplishment, not usually mentioned about him. His paleontological papers were published in facsimile in the 1970s in 10 volumes. His philosophical works circulated in mimeoform until his death. They then fell into the hands of his sister-in-law, who formed a committee which then brought out these books, beginning with The Phenomenon of Man, which initiated a Teilhard boom in around 1956. One of my first published papers was the biography of Teilhard in the Dictionary of Scientific Biography. At that time, Teilhard was a hot potato. The editors did not trust anybody within the Teilhardian movement, and they apparently could not identify any senior historian of science who would touch it, particularly since Teilhard's reputation among scientists had been shattered by P.B. Medawar's vicious review of The Phenomenon of Man in 1961. So it was safer to recruit an unknown neophyte like myself. If they were expecting a hatchet job, they didn't get one, because I wrote mainly about his work in paleontology and geology, with one paragraph only on his account of evolutionary mechanisms. As I continued to study Catholic evolutionism, I had other opportunities to revisit his work, particularly as it influenced that of his leading disciple in Spain, the Catalan paleontologist Miquel Crucifont-Peiró. Crucifont was, like Teilhard himself, a friend and correspondent of George Gaylord Simpson, and he told Simpson once, Crucifont did, that although he was a finalist and orthogeneticist, he also professed with no apparent conflict to include himself within the compass of the synthetic theory. And indeed, it was Crucifont who took the lead in introducing the synthetic theory in Spanish paleontology. Crucifont, one of the architects of quantitative biology in Europe, worked increasingly in the 1950s and 60s under the presuppositions of the synthetic theory, while continuing to explain the meaning of evolution in Teilhardian terms, and by continuing to insist on orthogenesis, even after Simpson showed him that his graph of straight-line evolution was just the line of regression to the mean in a particular paper. So it was within this paradox in mind, how can you be a teleologist, an orthogeneticist, and subscribe to the synthetic theory, that I wanted to have a fresh look at Teilhard's legacy. When we look at secondary comments on Teilhard's biology, what we generally find are different interpretations deduced or inferred from a very small set of passages dispersed throughout his work. He is presumed to have been disinterested in evolutionary theory, and that I think is true, but that doesn't mean that he had no theory. These passages that have been looked at again and again are decontextualized, and to get where we need to go, continual exegesis of the same passages doesn't lead anywhere. So I'm coming from somewhere else. I doubt, for example, that tâtonnement, groping, and hasard dirigé, directed chance, which have been the centerpiece of discourse around Teilhard's evolutionary theory, I doubt that those are phrases that Teilhard thought of himself or pulled out of thin air. Rather, they have specific histories that began before Teilhard started using them, so I want today to try to restore the context to some of his ideas. Well, was Teilhard a Darwinian, a Lamarckian, or both? And to what degree? Teilhard, speaking at the metaphysical level, says that precise mechanisms don't matter. All approaches attest to the reality of evolution, which, at this level of discourse, is what interests him. Teilhard's popular works, as many of you know already from experience, are layered. He mixes biological, metaphysical, theological, and mystical discourse without informing the reader of any transitions that he may happen to make. And as a result, the Teilhardian corpus, taken as a whole, has become a kind of open text because it can support a wide variety of statements about the nature of evolution. And for that reason, all sorts of mischief can be introduced without fear of being found out. Teilhard's view of science was that of Duhem, who he followed in such matters. Science is phenomenal. It deals with what you can see or experience. It does not deal with causation. Philosophy is causal. In order to retain my sanity, I have to keep reminding myself of this when reading Teilhard. Incidentally, there's a nice book on Teilhard in which Duhem's influence on him is discussed. One of the few books on Teilhard that makes sense to me, Robert J. O'Connell, Teilhard's Vision of the Past, The Making of a Method, New York, 1982. Now, to talk first about Teilhard and evolutionary theory, that is Darwinism and Lamarckism, as the terms are used or not used by Teilhard and or by his commentators. Teilhard's Darwinism has been gotten wrong by everyone except Jean Gaillon, more later on his startling finding. Lamarckism in Teilhard has been gotten wrong by everyone I've read. I can't say that no one has gotten it right because the literature is immense. Some commentators have got a piece of it, but in general there's been a willful misreading of Teilhard's Lamarckism, willful because his application of Lamarck is very specific. He says what it refers to and what it does not refer to. And in Teilhard's account, it does not apply to biological evolution. Here's Ludovico Galeni's conclusion with regard to Teilhard's theoretical orientation. Quoting from Galeni, beginning in the 30s with his stay in China, Teilhard experienced an abrupt cultural change. In his former circles of French Catholicism and the French scientific and paleontological establishment, the prevailing attitude towards Darwinism was skeptical. In the more cosmopolitan Peking culture, with its prevalence of English-speaking colleagues, the scientific environment was generally Darwinian. Furthermore, scientists in this circle were at that time arriving at the revision of neo-Darwinism called the modern synthesis. And he continues, the effects of this cultural change are noticeable in Teilhard's work. In fact, he began to realize the importance of Darwinian mechanisms. In scientific papers written before his experience in China, he referred to hypotheses that tended to explain evolutionary mechanisms by placing both Lamarck and Darwin in the same level, without a definitive choice in favor of one or the other. During the Chinese period, though, his scientific writings, at least, begin to favor Darwinian mechanisms. He's got a piece of it. I'll make a case for an alternative interpretation that Teilhard was, in fact, a Darwinian before China, a Darwinian after China, with attention to Lamarck mainly at the level of culture, not so much biology. Because when you're not French and you're talking about French biology, you assume that the person is a Lamarckian unless otherwise proven. So I think the key to Darwin's impact on Teilhard is contained in his approach to phylogenetic trees. Darwin, of course, gave visual expression to his view of descent with modification in the form of a branching tree of phylogeny. Where's the switch? Right here. Got it. This, of course, is the famous sketch of a tree of life from Notebook B of Darwin. This is a formalized chart, which is abstract. Oddly enough, in France, according to Gaillon, where Darwin meant these Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, meant them to be generations, French paleontologists read those as strata. So no wonder they had such trouble understanding what Darwin had to say. Right, this is a diagram of the evolution of a horse, branching evolution of a horse by Albert Gaudry, French paleontologist. This was the first such chart drawn by any paleontologist. Darwin wrote to Quatrefages that he had heard of no Frenchman other than Gaudry who supported his views. In French paleontological journals, from around 1880, this is 1866, but from around 1880, journals studied by Gaillon, no such charts were produced in France again till Teilhard's from 1915 to 1921, and I'll show you those. He's using, let's superimpose them for a minute. He's using kind of the graphic style of Gaudry. It's obvious that he's patterned these charts after Gaudry. These are kind of standard genealogical trees based on morphology. They look unremarkable to us because we're used to seeing these kind of trees. All right, so what is the bottom line here? The bottom line is that from, I'll get it later. The bottom line is that from 1880, but based on this single but crucial criterion, from 1880 to 1939, when Jean Viret drew another one, Teilhard was the only Darwinian paleontologist in France. And that is, I sure was shocked when I heard that. No one else in the room seemed to know what Gaillon was talking about, but I thought it was interesting. Repeat, the only Darwinian paleontologist in France, based on this one criterion. Gaillon concludes, the period 1900 to 1950 corresponds to a general movement of the autonomization of paleontology in France relative to natural history in general. 19th century authors were much bolder. Some made phylogenies, others not, but there was a huge public controversy about whether phylogenetic hypotheses were admissible or not in paleontology. After 1900, French paleontology tended to become more professional and correlatively decoupled from biology. It was mainly a science aiming at measuring geological time. So evolution was not a priority question, and Teilhard was a major exception in this respect. As strange as it might appear, still Gaillon, he was the key figure that progressively restored the interests of French paleontologists in evolution, a historical phenomenon that became visible only after World War II, particularly since from 1923, Teilhard was in China. Especially with respect to human evolution, French paleontology had continued to show an orientation that has either been covertly opposed to or silent regarding the depiction of schemes that try to arrange the known fossil schemes into an evolutionary sequence. So Dionne's finding at least will force, or should force, a re-examination of the whole question of Teilhard's approach to evolution in general, and to Darwin's brand of it in particular. If you're a Lamarckian, you don't draw charts like that. You don't conceptualize evolution like that. All right, now to talk about specific aspects of Teilhard's evolutionism. His most cited statement about his concept of an evolutionary mechanism is, quote, this is from the Phenomenon of Man, once more, this time on the plane of animate particles, we find the fundamental technique of groping, which is tâtonnement, the specific and invincible weapon of all expanding multitudes. This groping strangely combines the blind fantasy of large numbers with the precise orientation of a specific target. Groping is directed chance, hasard dirigé. It means pervading everything so as to try everything, and trying everything so as to find everything. Surely, in the last resort, it is precisely to develop this procedure, always increasing in size and cost in proportion as it spreads, that nature has had recourse to profusion. So now I want to talk about tâtonnement and what it means and where it came from. There's a lot of silly stuff out there about tâtonnement. The tâtonner, it's when you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't see anything and you're looking for a light switch. That's what it's blind. All right, so Bernard Towers. Teilhard's coining of the word groping is a stroke of genius, since groping movements may appear random in isolation, but have a degree of directionality. Thomas Berry. Groping implies a disquiet, an incompleteness. It also has the excitement of discovery and ecstatic transformation. Dobzhansky, an important evolutionary biologist, saw the term as impressionistic but remarkably apposite. Sir John Eccles said that by blind groping, Teilhard meant that the randomness of the mutational changes gives essentially a blind trial of an enormous number of possible changes. That's a better account. All right, now, when you Google for tâtonnement, you don't find Teilhard. What you find is a theory of that name, tâtonnement, an economic theory, which had a technical meaning that Teilhard almost certainly borrowed from the great classical French economist Léon Walras, 1834 to 1910, one of the founders of general equilibrium theory and the most widely read French economist of his time. The problem addressed by Walras was to show how a market economy with many goods reaches an equilibrium, that is, how supply, in terms of quantities of commodities, came to be valued, that is, priced. The system reaches equilibrium through tâtonnement, gropings, a process of trial and error, something like a bidding process where buyers and sellers specify what they are willing to buy or sell and at what price. This was kind of a thought experiment which required Walras to specify that no exchanges were actually made until the equilibrium was reached. So in evolution, variations, which are commodities, in Walras's terms, grope for niches of demand until an equilibrium, which is the price, is reached. Natural selection, of course, is just such a trial and error theory. Walras himself said that natural selection was one of the key theories of the 19th century. It was well known that his theory of tâtonnement was a trial and error Darwinian style construction. So bringing the system into equilibrium is the purpose both of the market and of natural selection. And so my notion is that just as Darwin had appropriated Adam Smith's conceptualization of how market equilibrium is reached, Teilhard also used a market analogy using, I think, Walras's terms and concepts. What in this passage does Teilhard mean by large numbers always increasing in size and cost in proportion as it spreads? What does he mean by cost? In French, it's le moyen de développer ce geste toujours plus énorme et plus coûteux à mesure qu'il s'étend davantage. More costly. It seems out of place. It looks to me like he was copying down something from Walras and put the cost in. It's a double. Walras was doing a metaphor, and this is a double metaphor, and I don't think you get anywhere by being too precise. But the more costly, the economic language may be a reference to a Walrasian auction. Costs looking to be priced. It seems odd, but Walras's theory was very widely known. I think there's more to be done on this, particularly by trying to compare Teilhard's language to either to Walras himself or to popularizations of Walras. All right, what about orthogenesis? Teilhard is associated with orthogenesis. Orthogenesis is straight-line, non-branching evolution. It acquired the connotation of an internally generated process. So when here's alternative technology like orthoselection, which is a primary selective pressure that results in a self-perpetuating evolutionary trend, or iterative evolution, the repeated evolution of similar or parallel structures in the development of the same main line, probably due to morphogenic control exerted by certain regulatory genes. Stephen Jay Gould refers to channeled evolution. And then we heard another one today, which was landscape, evolutionary landscape. It's pretty much the same thing that Teilhard had in mind, except that the word is not used because it has teleological connotations. While Teilhard claimed that orthogenesis was essential and indispensable, his understanding of this term was an unusual one. Dobzhansky observed years ago, quote, "The manifest property of living matter to form a system in which terms succeed each other experimentally, following the constantly increasing values of central complexity." What this seems to mean, following Dobzhansky, is that seen in retrospect and in totality, evolution was indeed progressive and in this sense directional and oriented. And then Dobzhansky adds, despite his professed belief in orthogenesis, Teilhard did not regard evolution as predetermined. More can be said, however. First, until around 1940, all paleontologists were orthogeneticists. In the 1940s, according to Gould, only George Simpson and 2 or 3 other paleontologists were not orthogeneticists. Second, Teilhard liked the notion of directionality in evolution because it supported his overall philosophical view, onwards and upwards towards the omega point. But he also wanted to detach the process from teleology. To do that, he had to redefine the term orthogenesis, and he found in an odd animal, the mole rat, just the phylogenetic history that he required. The mole rats had separated early on in their phylogeny into 3 branches, each of which followed an independent evolutionary line. But in all 3, there independently appeared similar traits: an increase in size, inception of continuous growth of the molars, and a fusion of the cervical vertebrae. He concluded that these changes were indicative of directionality in evolution, and to examples of this type, he applied the term orthogenesis, but redefined as the appearance of similar characteristics in groups related but already separated. When Teilhard presented his findings at famous 1947 Paris Conference on Evolution, organized by Jean Piveteau, a Lamarckian paleontologist, attended by the leading French paleontologists, all Lamarckians except for Teilhard, along with a couple of geneticists, and then some of the leaders of the synthetic theory. Simpson was there, Huxley or Haldane, I don't remember who. Simpson replied to Teilhard's paper on the mole rat that this case of parallel evolution could be explained by orthoselection, and it was not surprising that newly separated phyletic branches should retain similar genetic makeups and develop in parallel ways when undergoing similar selective pressures. I think here it may just be a matter of emphasis since the facts were not in doubt. Now, the mole rat, not a fossil this time, but living mole rats, have turned up in recent evolutionary debates. It is the only known vertebrate that displays eusociality. That is, it displays the social organization of bees and ants. This is a population of mole rats in Africa. And this is a stunning example of evolutionary convergence. As a non-Teilhardian paleontologist notes, quote, this man is named Mark McMenamin. He says, Teilhardians should take heart in this result and could call it the revenge of the mole rats. I'd like to meet this guy. For if evolution could evoke such profound behavioral convergences in such dramatically unrelated animals as termites and mole rats, then a large amount of what Teilhard has written about directionality in evolution gains credibility. There are forces afoot that dramatically constrain the course of evolutionary change. Simpson's complaint, this is McMenamin talking, Simpson's complaint, now referring to the 1947 exchange, about directed evolution in the fossil mole rat collapses when confronted with the case of modern eusocial mammals. Convergent evolution and iterative evolution demonstrate that evolution can be directional and is quite capable of, quote, going somewhere. Now, for similar reasons, namely cases of iterative evolution, Teilhard liked to talk about the development of marsupials in Australia, whose isolation induced particular lines of development in multiple branches separated early. And on a macro level, he was interested in cerebralization, which of course takes place all across the animal kingdom in widely separated phyletic branches. The evolution of sight would be another example. Now, I've been talking mainly about divergent evolution, but of course Teilhard was more interested in convergent evolution. And it was this interest in convergent evolution that Simpson and others read as teleological, and therefore the suspect kind of orthogenesis. There's not all that much research done on convergent evolution compared to divergent. Now, Lamarckism. People used to dismiss Teilhard by saying, oh, he's a Lamarckian. His position on Lamarck is, first, he rejects the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Two, his position on pouvoir de la vie, which is Lamarck's internal mechanism that drives the animal towards adaptation, is ambivalent with respect to organic evolution. He gets around it by saying that in animals it is unconscious. So the problem here is, how do you retain randomness and teleology at the same time? You do this by finding a mechanism that channels random variation. One way Teilhard does this is to say that there is an internal drive, Lamarckian style, but it is unconscious. Lamarck called this drive besoin, while Teilhard substitutes désir, which of course weakens his argument. So that's the kind of semantic mess you run into with Teilhard. However, since he says the same thing many times in different books, you can find the one that you like best. 3, Lamarckian mechanisms only come to the fore with the onset of culture. Darwin, of course, knew that in general terms, natural selection had ceased to be operative in human society. We know this because, as Darwin remarks in a famous and witty observation in the chapter on moral faculties in The Descent of Man, that if natural selection had been operative among human beings, the earth would now be populated exclusively by Greeks. It's a terrific witty witticism of Darwin. And then Huxley diffused the notion that of the inoperation of natural selection in human society in his influential book of essays, Evolution and Ethics. Now, here's what Darwin says, what Teilhard says about this. Quote, the Darwinian era of survival by natural selection, parenthesis, the vital thrust, poussée vitale, is thus succeeded by a Lamarckian era of super life. I think that's a bad translation. What's meant is the supra-organic, brought about by the calculated invention, parentheses, vital impulse, French, élan vital, which is Bergson's term for that impulse, but he's redefining élan vital as a cultural, as cultural inventivity, separating it from the biological. Or, quote, from the moment when humankind recognizes that it is in a state of evolution, it can no longer progress unless it develops in itself a deep-rooted, passionate zest for its own evolution. That is, that moment is when culture takes over. All of this makes perfect sense. Who's laughing?
And I like Teilhard.
Get these people out of here.
Yes, you were saying this makes perfect sense.
Well, it does. Let me rephrase. It's obvious, and many people have written about the fact that culture can be described in Lamarckian terms, because in fact, in culture is passed along by something that resembles the inheritance of acquired characteristics, only it's not an inheritance in a biological sense. Teilhard almost never uses the word culture. He never cites a cultural anthropologist, and therefore, not unexpectedly, has no theory of culture at all. This is all the more peculiar because he was supported in his last years in New York by the Wenner-Gren Foundation, which is an anthropological institution. Nor do any of the commentaries mention culture, talk about culture, either, or give any indication that the emergence of culture caused the cessation of natural selection in human society, or that any great divide had been passed thereby. No cultural anthropologist would have appealed to Lamarck to account for culture change. However, Teilhard occasionally refers to the superorganic, with reference, for example, to the noosphere. And this is a term that cultural anthropologists like A.O. Kroeber and Leslie White did use, the supra-organic, which is the world of thought. But since it's superorganic, it is not regulated by anything organic. Now, Darwin is not completely clear on this because he knows that natural selection and culture existed at the same time in primal hordes. Those groups that displayed the greater degree of social cohesion, which is a cultural trait, will tend to do better in the never-ceasing wars of savages, which is an allusion to Hobbes, than tribes that were less well endowed. The trait that produces this effect he calls sympathy, which is a term borrowed from Adam Smith and Rousseau, which, Darwin says, with the passage of a sufficient number of generations, will tend to be fixed hereditarily. The remote stirrings of the largely trivialized debate about the altruism gene. Culture, by its supra-organic nature, cannot be hardwired. Geez, I'm still fighting E.O. Wilson, aren't I?
No, it's only been 33 years.
Yeah, right.
Half the people in this room weren't alive.
Exactly. That's why I get away with this stuff.
Remember, history happens twice.
Right. All right, so when does culture, in a modern anthropological sense, appear in early man? In social contract theory, it's a concomitant of civil society, and Darwin's narrative in Chapter 5 of The Descent is a recasting of social contract theory with a biological patina over it. That was Darwin's unstated perception. Of course, reality is less clear. The higher primates have a simple culture which they can pass on to their children through an educational process. So with Teilhard, the emergence of culture is the functional equivalent to the emergence of civil society of the Enlightenment contract theorists. Now I say this because social contract theory has a long shadow. Teilhard uses the word invention in an idiosyncratic and interesting way. For example, does the rearrangement of matter that generates what he calls complexification come about through a process that causes it to rearrange itself, quote, being conceived by psychic forces analogous to our human power of invention, which would be Lamarckian, still quoting Teilhard, or does it come from without via the automatic selection? Well, he's saying the same thing, that once one has culture, natural selection ceases. But this is a great example of a passage where the slippage from biology into metaphysics makes it difficult to understand. I might note parenthetically here that Teilhard frequently makes reference to psychic forces operating in lower animals like protistas, or even in inorganic matter. And this ultimately derives from Haeckel's concept of recapitulation at its broadest. The logic is this. Since ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny from its very beginning in the simplest life forms, then these must be endowed with the primitive form of any and all systems found in higher forms, including man. And it was Haeckel's logic. We are endowed with psychology, so amoeba must also be, not to mention viruses, also have a psychology. And so it gives rise to a genre of biological writings with titles like Alfred Binet's The Psychic Life of Microorganisms in 1897. It seems ludicrous to us, but it was within the logic of Darwinian biology as then construed. You know, and Teilhard liked this kind of thinking because it seemingly lent force to his cosmic evolutionary scheme. And I think it may be possible to represent his law of complexity consciousness as a recapitulation trope, simply because you can't argue. The only context you can argue that the simplest organisms have consciousness, that the least complex organisms have consciousness, the only way that makes sense is through a kind of recapitulationist logic. The invention in animals, getting down there, the invention among animals to which he refers is instinctive. Quote, neither analyzed nor calculated by its authors, but an invention all the same, or what comes to the same thing, the awakening or translation in an organism of a desire and potentiality, a sort of anticipation of a capacity that launched terrestrial animals into the water, and so forth. Here he is flirting with Lamarckism, even though he recognizes that, quote, the Lamarckian pouvoir de vie of the heritability of acquired characteristics is a biologically vieux jeu. This is actually a commentator on Teilhard, and decisively refuted up to the level of thought, that is culture. Teilhard repeats this over and over again, but sometimes he leaves out the unconscious part. The desire to persist in being, Teilhard argues, is basic to any conception of human nature. Indeed, humanity does not just assert its will to persist in being, but also possesses the means of furthering this goal. Among the human species, natural selection, as the motivating force of evolution, is replaced by the power of invention. Teilhard occasionally argues that differing modes of interpretation are complementary, and he uses the term complementarity. The first usage that I've been able to find in Teilhard is after Bohr had coined the term in a particular way, and I take its meaning at face value and assume that Teilhard, who was originally destined for a career in physics, kept abreast of research in that field. Complementarity in this sense implies eschewing specific explanatory modes, whether Darwinian or Lamarckian, or granting to each explanation equal status, which in places Teilhard does explicitly. It's as if he says, don't let the details of evolutionary mechanisms deter us from focusing on the fact of evolution itself. And he does that all the time. And it's the fact of evolution itself that drives his metaphysical and philosophical system. But he's saying this really not on a biological level, but on some other level. He says this: I have left a fundamental part in the morphogenic action of instinct to the Darwinian play of external forces and chance. Life proceeds not only by strikes of luck that are recognized and grasped. Neo-Lamarckian anti-chance is not merely the negation, but on the contrary, the utilization of Darwinian chance. There's a function of complementarity between the two facts. That is complementarity in well, it could, I think it's in Bohr's term. It's in Bohr's usage, that there are different forms of explanation that have a value that does not at some level conflict. Or he could just be using the conventional meaning. There's a function of complementarity between the two facts, that is, chance, anti-chance. There is reason to separate out two major ones in the unity of the organized world and to treat them in different ways. The Lamarckian zone of very large complexes above the human being, that is, culture, the superorganic, where anti-chance visibly predominates, and the Darwinian zone of small complexes, lower living things, where the only way this same anti-chance can be perceived beneath the veil of chance is by reason or conjecture, that is, indirectly. So there in the human phenomenon, he really, that's the clearest statement he makes, that Lamarckian mechanisms only operate in the superorganic world. Now, of course, I know what everybody else knows, that Teilhard did not always draw a clear line between biology and the philosophy that it informs. Or it is difficult to know where Teilhard is when he shifts from reality into metaphor. Almost done. I think it's instructive to look at Crucifant, the Teilhardian finalist vertebrate paleontologist that I mentioned before, who was very articulate and precise, if not always completely clear about what he thought. He stated, Crucifant, that he was both a Teilhardian and a neo-Darwinian at the same time. A non-Lamarckian orthogeneticist who assigned a particular role for selection and chance in the process. That kind of discourse raises the question of what Teilhard called complementarity. Finally, to talk now a little bit about hasard dirigé, about directed chance. The phrase itself was out there. It comes up with the discussion of Bernoulli's theorem, for example. The more coins that you flip, the more predictable the outcome is. That's basically what the Bernoulli theorem is. But there are all kinds of other little statistical tricks that turn up in Teilhard to support his views. So what does he mean by directed chance? There were a number of paleontologists contemporary with Teilhard who tried to explain a non-teleological approach by assuming something like what Gould calls channeled evolution, as in the case of the Irish elk, whose antlers developed too much in a single direction and caused its extinction. Daniele Rosa, an Italian paleontologist contemporary of Teilhard, in his theory of hologenesis, suggested that with each new adaptation, the pool of prospective new mutations useful to the organism and available for further adaptation would be consistently diminished. And that's more or less what evolutionary geography, is that what the term was? Evolutionary geography? Yeah, something like that. It's the same, and there are half a dozen such theories, but they all have the same end of trying to explain the closing down of possibilities for adaptation, and therefore the resultant channeling of certain traits. All right, I think I'll stop there and talk about it.
Questions?
I've got two comments to make,
yeah,
and I'm going to use the same example to illustrate both.
Okay, good.
So you said somewhere along your talk that once we have culture, natural selection stops.
Right.
And then, well, before you talked about convergent evolution.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And you use convergent evolution to argue in favor of some sort of directionality in evolution.
Right.
Am I right?
I quoted someone.
You quoted that. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use an example, and the example I'm going to use is the evolution of lactose tolerance.
Of
our capacity to digest milk into adulthood.
Yeah. Okay. Got
right?
it.
Okay. So it's a textbook example of convergent evolution. Mm-hmm. Because it arose independently in Europe and in Africa, mm-hmm. right? It's the same adaptation, only that it's caused by two different mutations. So it doesn't show any directionality. It just shows that nature can repeat itself from time to time.
Right, and I think it was Teilhard's. Teilhard was not able to see that
exactly.
did not necessarily mean directionality. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the capacity to digest lactose appeared because of the beginnings of agriculture, beginnings of farming. So because human societies started to, keep cattle, they started to consume more milk, and therefore a mutation that would confer the capacity to digest lactose would spread rapidly in the population.
Yeah,
and that is another textbook example of cultural directed evolution. Or culture.
Okay. Yeah, I am.
So the point I want to make really is that, in Argentina we have a saying that the story is written by the winners and not by the losers. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And therefore, we can see directionality because what we're observing is the fossil record of the winners, not of the losers. So, we see a pattern but because
Sure.
we have limited data available.
Gould used to say, you know, Gould used to say that paleontologists they would line their samples up, you know, on their desk, and they'd look down the line, and it looked like a straight line to them. Yeah. Also, vitamin D and wheat and sunlight with the invention of agriculture. There was a kind of similar thing.
Sunlight.
Yeah. So people tended to become, Africans who came out of Africa tended, when they became weed eaters, tended to become lighter skinned. Yeah, sorry.
John Boyle.
You seem to think it's strange that Teilhard would attribute a psychic aspect to lower forms of life. But it seems quite similar to me to the process theology of Whitehead and David Griffith and others. And isn't the rationale that since we have mind and body, and since we evolved, and since you can't get mind from body, that therefore mind or consciousness should have been there in the lower forms?
But that's recapitulation, isn't it?
Well, maybe, but I find
Yeah.
it no less implausible than the strange emergence of mind from matter.
Right, but when you're getting down to one-celled animals, then you're really talking about irritability and not psychology. So there's a kind of playing around with these terms. But I see what you mean, of course.
Steve Fuller.
First, on this point, actually, that view was held quite a lot in the 19th century. Gustav Fechner, for example, would be kind of the main person to look for there, the founder of psychophysics, who had this kind of view that psychic life starts at the smallest organism. And I just one point to get clear here. When you were talking about this book, The Psychic Life of Microorganisms, you cited as the author Alfred Binet. That's the inventor of the IQ test.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that. That's interesting. But the question I wanted to ask was, given the way in which you were characterizing how culture constitutes this break with natural selection and where invention becomes sort of the dominant force, this reminds me a lot, and I was wondering to what extent Teilhard would be influenced by Condorcet. I don't know if you've looked into that, because
No, that's great. Yeah.
yeah, because see, Condorcet also had this kind of view of human dominion over the planet, and that invention would be the driving force, and it does have a lot of those Teilhardian aspects. And when you were sort of drawing the connection between the kind of Lamarckianized notion of culture and social contract theory from the 18th century, right? Condorcet would also be kind of a relevant precedent for that as well. And also in the history of population theory, right? Condorcet is Malthus's foil, right? Malthus is writing the book against Condorcet, so there might be some. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So maybe this is part of what's in the, intellectual unconscious of Teilhard's thinking.
Well, but one of the only ways you can find out what Teilhard is reading is by going through his letters. So every time.
But it fills in a kind of missing link, you might say,
No,
given the kind of picture you've been portraying about his background.
As a positivist, I'm reluctant to make huge jumps, but it seems to me, there's a logic.
Yeah.
There's a logic in his illogic.
No, I know,
Yeah.
I know.
Thank you.
Other? Yes.
Luke O'Malley.
When you were commenting on his use of walrus,
Yeah.
you seem puzzled by the notion of cost.
I have a hard time seeing the analogy, and I need an economist to tell me what it is.
Would the obvious one be failures to adapt evolutionary dead ends?
Cost.
How about something like parental investment?
We're talking about evolution now. I mean,
the more variations, the greater the cost of adaptation, something like that.
Yeah, in a sense, because you're wasting
Yeah.
life. There's going to be a lot of extinction.
yeah,
Yeah.
there are extinctions.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that I said to Guyan, I said, "Oh, what about Tatanomon?" He said, "No, that's just another word." But it seems to me that where there's smoke, there's fire, and the two Tatanomont theories
that
are
sounds good,
very,
actually.
very,
That one
they're
sounds
very
good.
similar.
And when you come, I mean, one of the reasons why I think of this is that I have imprecise memories of an essay that I read about 25 years ago by Lauren Graham, when he's talking about what Teilhard in places regards as the cultural requirements to make up for the absence of Darwinian evolution now. And he actually speaks crudely of the necessity for eliminating malformed children. He's a eugenicist.
Teilhard.
Teilhard, yes. Well, Graham quotes it to
Yeah, okay.
Graham
That's,
quotes it to this effect. I mean, shockingly it was to me.
well, but it fits, that's in the zeitgeist too, of eugenics. And,
Dobzhansky would be another one in this category.
but that's very interesting because most Catholics kind of were soft eugenicists,
Oh, yeah.
not hard eugenicists.